When Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed to travel to China for a summit with some of the most important non-Western leaders in the world, he had some goals in mind. He wanted to project power, both through his alliances and as an individual. And perhaps more importantly, he wanted to be seen among people who outwardly support his invasion of Ukraine. But the summit didn't go as planned. Putin ended up being humiliated in China as his allies refused to back him on the Ukraine invasion. Worse yet, for Russia's president, he ended up being a bit part player compared to a supposed ally that's long superseded Russia. From August 31st to September 1st, China hosted the 25th annual Heads of Council meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO. What was once a meeting between the leaders of a handful of anti-West nations has blossomed into a semi-global affair, with this year's event seeing the city of Tianjin welcome more than 20 leaders of what CNBC calls non-Western countries to the summit. This was supposed to be a display of power, and though China would take center stage by virtue of hosting the event, Russia sought to project relevance within a multipolar narrative in the new worldwide security and economic order that the SCO's members want to create. And on the surface, the summit seemed to achieve its primary goal of being a showcase of the power of the non-West. A massive military parade was held. Photographs poured out of the summit showing various leaders conversing with one another. Putin had an opportunity to escape the Western isolationism he's foisted onto Russia due to his invasion, if only for a couple of days, as he got to play the leader hobnobbing with the anti-West elite. Beyond that, the SCO is intended to deliver a message to the West. Speaking to Times Radio on September 1st, Sergei Radchenko of Johns Hopkins University explains how, when it comes to the world leaders who attended the SCO summit.
They represent a lot of economic might. You have China, you have India that has become a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization alongside with Pakistan a few years ago. You also have Russia, which perhaps is not as economically important, but still a major power.
Immediately, there's a hint as to why this latest iteration of the SCO summit was so humiliating for Putin. Russia's status is actively being diminished among its peers thanks to the war that Putin started, meaning each time that Putin visits, he's being seen as less than he wants to be seen as. But more on that humiliation in a moment. As Radchenko adds regarding the summit,
generally the leaders of this grouping of countries basically trump up the importance of the global south. They're saying that the West has declined into irrelevance or is declining into irrelevance, and they are the real thing.
That's the intended message of the entire summit, and Putin is more than happy to attend any event that allows him to spread that message, regardless of how true it really is. But when it comes to the goals Russia's leader had for this event, being just one voice in an ever-growing crowd of countries wasn't especially high on his agenda. He went into the 2025 SCO summit with another goal in mind, drumming up support from supposed allies for Russia's war in Ukraine. One of the countries in attendance has certainly been offering that support. North Korea is perhaps Russia's staunchest ally, with the two having signed a cooperative defense pact back in the summer of 2024. Since then, North Korea has been funneling soldiers and military equipment into Russia, proving itself to be a valuable ally. But as useful as North Korea is to Putin, it's an isolated country that holds little credibility on the global stage. At the 2025 SCO summit, Putin was looking for a major player to come out in support of his illegal invasion. China would have been ideal. China is something of an ally to Russia in the Ukraine war. It's certainly been making plenty of money from selling dual-use components to Russia that can serve either commercial or military purposes. These components are wide-ranging, with a September 2nd report by The Telegraph claiming that they include everything from microchips and aircraft engines to metal alloys and fiberglass. However, the fact that these components are dual-use, with none being outright specified for military use, and certainly not weapons that Russia can use, hints at something that has likely stuck in Putin's craw for the last few years. China has never publicly stated support for Putin's invasion. Whenever China says anything about the Ukraine war, it uses carefully chosen language to express support for an end to the conflict without saying that it's backing Russia. As recently as August 6, TRT Global reported that China has reasserted its neutrality in the conflict through Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhou Jiakun. On the Ukraine crisis, China's position is consistent and clear. We've been committed to promoting talks for peace and the end of fighting, Zhou said in response to Ukrainian claims that Chinese mercenaries were operating in Ukraine. Now, whether China's actions align with its words isn't important here. What is important is that nobody in China's leadership hierarchy has ever stood behind Putin and offered support for his invasion. Every message delivered is diplomatic, tailored to express neutrality as China walks a tightrope between providing components that Russia can use against Ukraine and outwardly expressing a desire for the war to end in peace. When Putin traveled to China in late August, one of his key goals would have been to finally get that much-needed expression of support, if not from China, then perhaps from India or any other country other than North Korea. The Guardian suggested as much in an August 30 report in which it claimed that the Ukraine war would have been on the top of Putin's agenda during the 2025 SCO summit. It quoted Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center Director Alexander Gabuyev, who said, "It's an important time for them to talk about where the war is headed and how likely it is to be stopped in the near future. The two leaders need to compare notes and make sure they're on the same page. This is important because the war has become one of the main pillars of their relationship." Putin wanted that outward show of support. He needed it. And that need is what ultimately led to his great humiliation. As important as the Ukraine war is to Putin, it ended up being a non-factor at the 2025 SCO summit. Yes, discussions may have occurred behind closed doors, but when it comes to the public legitimacy that Putin so craves from his supposed allies, none was forthcoming. Another leader who attended the summit was Alexander Lukashenko, the self-appointed president of Belarus. Franak Vyakorka, who is the chief political advisor for Lukashenko's exiled political rival Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, explained to Times Radio why Putin left the 2025 SCO summit feeling so humiliated.
I think this summit was actually a failure for Putin too, because in the final declaration there was no single word about the war in Ukraine from the Russian position. And I think that Putin did not manage to convince Xi to take a Russian position regarding Ukraine.
The real value of the summit for Putin was his effort to seek legitimacy from the country he wants so desperately to be an outward ally. Yet, as he always has, China's President Xi Jinping gave Putin's attempts to guide him toward offering approval for Russia's actions short shrift. Putin left the summit empty-handed, at least in terms of what he wanted most. But this disregard for his invasion only scratches the surface of the humiliation that Russia's leader experienced. The real problem, buried beneath the lack of approval, lies in the changing positions of Russia and China. Where Russia was once the second most powerful nation in the world, beaten only by the United States, it's now fallen down the pecking order. China has taken Russia's place, economically and militarily, and the fact that Xi refuses to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Ukraine war publicly only goes to show something that Putin will never want to admit. China is the more important of the two parties in the China-Russia relationship, and the 2025 SCO summit proved it. The New York Times' September 1st report on the summit highlights this, noting that the entire event was an attempt to signal unity among global leaders who have very different agendas. Putin's tunnel vision when it comes to the Ukraine war clashes with the desires of leaders like Xi and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, both of whom will want to walk the line between empowering themselves and maintaining relationships with their Western trade partners. In that sense, the SCO summit is, and always has been, a sham. An outward display of non-Western unity that ignores the fact that even the most powerful nations that take part rely heavily on the West. The shame extends to what's evident in photographs. Posed pictures of Putin and Xi shaking hands are intended to paint the picture of two equal leaders who are united behind a singular vision. But all the while, the speeches being given at the summit highlight disunity. Putin used his talking time to decry the West for the part he claims it's played in his decision to start a war with Ukraine. Putin was also quick to mention how he had briefed Xi about the talks he'd held with US President Donald Trump in Alaska. A transparent attempt to rope China's president into talking about the Ukraine war failed. Instead, Xi used his opening speech to urge the members of the SCO to oppose a Cold War mentality, bloc confrontation, and bullying, the New York Times reports. It's almost as though that message was directed at Putin, whose Ukraine invasion is giving rise to the very mentality and bloc confrontation that Xi says should be avoided. Putin didn't just get a refusal to outwardly support his war from Xi, he almost received a condemnation for what has resulted. The same outlet also says that China, though projecting close ties with Russia publicly, is also watching the growing relationship between Russia and North Korea with wary eyes. China's aim to become the global geopolitical influencer isn't helped by Russia embracing a nation that's unpredictable and, in Xi's eyes, potentially dangerous. While Xi would never outright say it, what's apparent here is that China treating Russia as though it's a little brother in a relationship where China is the older brother. Subtle admonishments and mistrusts, all coming from the country that holds the most power in the SCO, serves as signs that China simply wants Putin to get in line. Others have spoken of this sort of relationship before. In March 2023, the Asia Society Policy Institute posed the question of whether Russia will ever get used to being China's little brother. It spoke of a then recent meeting between Xi and Putin, noting that the power dynamics between China and Russia have reversed from what they were during the glory days of the Soviet Union. China, the world's second superpower, is a senior partner to a Russia now enfeebled and isolated by its war in Ukraine and more dependent than ever on China for economic, technological, and diplomatic support, the institute said, highlighting China's economy being 10 times larger than Russia's and the rapidly modernizing People's Liberation Army as examples that prove China is now the big dog in the relationship. The Australian Institute of International Affairs made a similar point in a June 2024 article. It labels China as Russia's vassal, calling Putin's country a state dictatorship that's now trying to survive the war Putin started while relying on China for support whenever it can. China, for its part, is taking advantage of Russia's growing desperation. The sale of dual-use components is less likely about China supporting the Ukraine war and more about China being able to make money from what it sees as the dumb situation Putin has gotten himself into. The same could be said for China's Russian oil purchases. A lot has been made about how China is buying enough oil from Russia to account for 47% of Russia's crude exports as of June 2025. While some see this as China pumping much needed money into Russia's coffers, much of which China makes back through its component sales, China likely sees an opportunity to take advantage. Western sanctions have lowered the demand and price of Russian oil, meaning China is making hay while the sun shines at Russia's expense. Putin has to allow it because he has no other option. With China and India together, accounting for the vast majority of Russia's crude sales, there are few alternative buyers. This interesting relationship dynamic is reflected in Putin's failure, once again, to convince Xi to give him the outward support he craves. This is the big brother, little brother dynamic at play. The little brother, Russia, is constantly looking for approval from the big brother, and it's doing everything it can to get that approval. Russia sells its oil for less than what it's worth. It buys the Chinese components and engages in a masquerade of a cooperative relationship. China, for its part, is simply taking advantage of Russia's current situation while subtly admonishing Putin for his actions. Putin's humiliation is made complete by China treating him as the lesser partner, the one who needs approval that he's never going to get. Ultimately, one could argue that the relationship between Russia and China is all a game of mimicry, at least on the Chinese side. Ironically, one could say the same of the SCO summit itself. New Sky practically does in a September 4 report. Experts see the summit not as the birth of a triune bloc, but rather as a game of mimicry. Beijing is playing Go, closely watching the reaction of the United States and its allies, testing the possibility of taking a leadership position in a world where the West is losing its clear influence, the outlet says. There's no mention of Russia and its goals here, which only adds to Putin's humiliation. He's almost a non-factor at a summit where his country is meant to be one of the power players. Behind the photographs and the grandiose displays of military power, there is China. While it signed a memorandum to advance the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline and agreed to boost gas deliveries, China kept its rhetoric on Ukraine neutral and otherwise used the summit to position itself as the dominant non-Western power in the world. Nowhere was that clearer than in the military parade that followed the summit in Beijing. CNN reported on China's military parade, stating that more than 50,000 people gathered to watch a display of military power that included somewhere in the region of 10,000 soldiers. China showcased a host of innovative new weapons to complement its existing and extremely powerful arsenal. Anti-ship missiles, air defense lasers, undersea drones, and even robotic dogs were part of the showcase. All of these are weapons that Putin can't hope to get his hands on, given China's engineered Ukraine war neutrality. Worse yet, the sheer size and success of this military parade was essentially another way in which China put the little brother in its place. Contrast China's military parades with Russia's. Putin has a penchant for such parades, likely for the same reasons as Xi. They act as forthright displays of power. But where China's parades are becoming bigger and stronger over the years, Russia's have weakened substantially thanks to the Ukraine war. This was the case as far back as May 2022, when the Journal of Democracy published a piece covering what it called Putin's incredible shrinking victory parade. The 2022 iteration of Russia's annual Victory Day parade, which is meant to commemorate the Soviet victory in World War II, but is more often a showcase of Russian military might, was held against the backdrop of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky being hailed as a hero in many quarters. The journal said that the parade would inevitably descend into a propaganda show where Putin tries to display that he's right to do what he's doing in the present, rather than celebrating the victories of the past. And as the Ukraine war has dragged on for over 3 years since that 2022 version of the parade, Russia has only gotten weaker. It's lost thousands of units of military equipment, along with over 1 million soldiers. It's difficult to project power when a much smaller enemy is so ably calling that power into question. Fast forward to May 2025, and The Economist labelled Russia's military parades a sign of its weakness rather than its power. It also highlighted just how much smaller the Victory Day parade has become. In 2021, the year before Putin launched his invasion, the parade featured 2,009 vehicles. In 2022, it was 1,275, then down to 910 in 2023. 2024 stayed somewhat constant at 912 vehicles, but this shrinkage is a sign that Russia's military power isn't what Putin wants to project. Ukraine should have been defeated long before the Victory Day parade more than halved in size. All of this is without mentioning Russia's 2025 Navy Day parade. What was meant to be a showcase for Russia's military ships ended up being cancelled due to security concerns. Basically, Russia was scared of its ships being struck by Ukrainian drones. So now, Russia's grand military parades are being held under a cloud. The equipment Russia once proudly displayed is disappearing. Parades are being cancelled because of the threat Ukraine poses. Again, the power projection Putin seeks is non-existent. Now, imagine being in Putin's shoes at the SCO 2025 summit in Tianjin. China's military parade was larger and offered insight into a far more technologically advanced military than Russia could ever hope to muster after over 3 years of war. Some could argue that what Putin saw at the parade was more impressive than anything Russia showcased before the Ukraine war. It's in this parade that Putin's SCO humiliation was completed. Failure to secure approval from Russia's big brother for the Ukraine war was compounded by China rubbing an event that Russia can't pull off in Putin's face. All Putin could do was watch. A false smile plastered on his face as any vision he may have had of Russia being the dominant anti-West power crumbled before his eyes. Perhaps New Sky puts it best. The parade with Xi, Putin and Kim is a theatrical illustration of tectonic shifts, not the beginning of a new geopolitical era. Experts are unanimous. The alliance exists on paper, but in reality, the interests of the players are too different to talk about a real bloc opposing democracies. That lack of true unity will always be Putin's problem. Russia is now secondary to China, a country to be used by its bigger brother, as Putin tries to pretend that he's still the big dog in a relationship over which he has very little control. Now, humiliation in China is far from the only time that Putin has been left with egg on his face in very recent memory. Russia's supposed fifth-generation fighter is another source of humiliation for Putin. Russia's leader is desperate as no one wants his Su-57 fighter jets. Find out why so many countries, including China, are thumbing their noses at the Su-57 in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date coverage of the latest geopolitical developments.